Chapter 11. The Flight. Rose stood on the sea cliffs with Brightbill and Glimmer on her shoulders. They were staring down at the poison tide. The way it gently shimmered in the water was strangely beautiful. It was hard to believe it could be so dangerous, and yet its destructive power was plain to see. The coast was etched with dead plants, and the rocks were scattered with dead fish. Glimmer turned to Rose and said, "What do you think is causing the poison tide?" The robot searched her computer brain for explanations and said, "The poison tide might be similar to red tides, the harmful blooms of algae that can occur in the ocean. Or it might be ash that has erupted from an underwater volcano. Or it might be a toxic substance that has spilled from a tanker ship. Or it might be something else entirely. It would be helpful to study the poison tide up close. I can climb down to the rocks and examine the shallows, but I will need someone to watch for waves." Brightfield fluttered his wings and squawked, "Ma, don't go anywhere near the poison tide. We can't risk your safety. You're too important to the island." In the distance, another flock of birds were flying south over the ocean, and this gave Glimmer an idea. "Plenty of other birds are safely flying above the ocean," she said. "Brightbill and I could fly above the poison tide and see where it leads." "That's a good idea," said Brightbill. "We might learn something useful." The idea made Rose nervous, but she knew the geese would look out for each other. Once they were all in agreement, Brightbill and Glimmer took flight. They soared high above the poison tide and disappeared into the northern sky. 4 days later, on a drizzly afternoon, Brightbill and Glimmer returned and found Rose in her home. They sat together and the geese explained what they'd seen. "Luckily, the poison tide hasn't spread everywhere," said Brightbill. "It's more like a huge river flowing through the ocean, twisting and turning and spreading wider as it goes. We followed it north, around islands and along coastlines, and back out to open ocean. At times, the flow sank deep into the water and then surfaced again somewhere else. Eventually, the flow completely vanished down into the depth, so we headed home. On our way back, we flew with birds who were leaving the north," said Glimmer. "Nobody knows what's causing the poison tide, but everybody knows about the ancient shark. Some say she's as big as a whale, others say she's older than the sea. It sounded like the shark was nothing more than a legend, but the birds insisted that she's real and that she's the only one who can help. They don't know how to find the ancient shark. All they know is that she lives somewhere in the far north." Chapter 12. The Water. Whenever rain fell on the island, much of it filtered into the river. The water level would rise after a rainstorm and fall during a dry spell. But so many more animals were now drinking from the river that it was always running low. To make matters worse, many of the island's brooks and streams emptied right into the ocean, where all the water became undrinkable. In those challenging times, the animals couldn't afford to lose any fresh water. The robot didn't need water or food to survive, so she didn't feel the same fear felt by the animals. Instead, she felt something like sadness about the changes happening to the island. She also felt determination. Rose was determined to make things better, and she started by calling for an emergency meeting. The poison tide had put everybody in a foul mood, but after some convincing, the island leaders agreed to meet Rose on the banks of the river. Rose arrived first with Brightbill and Glimmer and the old goose Loudwing. Then came Chit-Chat and Fink and Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. Gale and Swooper fluttered down from the sky. Nettle and Thorn lumbered across the meadow. Crown Point, the buck, stepped out from the trees as Crake, the turtle, crawled out from a puddle. The last to arrive was Shelley, the sea otter, who wriggled up the muddy riverbank. The animals stood there sweating at flies and wondering why Rose had brought them to the spot. "The island is running out of fresh water," said Rose. She motioned to the river, which had shrunk to half its usual size. "However, if we work together, I believe we will have enough to survive." Fink barked. That's easy for you to say, Rose. You are not even alive, Shelley squeaked. With Fink's attitude, none of us will be alive much longer. Mr. Beaver grunted. You stay out of it, Shelley. Sea otters don't even belong here. Gale squawked. Leave Shelley alone. He's had it worse than any of us. The group kept quarreling until Loudwing let out a tremendous honk. Enough! We all want to survive. We're all on the same side. Let's try to remember that, shall we? Everyone nodded and muttered apologies, and then the meeting continued. Most animals can go days or weeks without food, said Rose, but they cannot survive nearly as long without water. It is essential that we hold on to as much fresh water as possible, and I have a plan to do just that. Soon, an army of animals was crowding into the great meadow, and Rose was calling out instructions. Beavers, build dams in every brook and stream. We must not let any fresh water pour into the ocean. Otters, moose, turtles, dredge the bottom of every pond. Make them as deep as you can. Bears, groundhogs, weasels, hares, badgers. I have marked where pits should be dug. Dig into the dirt as far down as you can go. Dams were built, turning narrow trickles into wide ponds. Trenches were carved into the ground, diverting water from the river to many deep pits that had been dug. Newly built ponds, along with the old ones, were dredged deeper and deeper. Within days, the island was dotted with dozens of deep ponds. At first, they were empty, but with each passing storm, rainwater surged through the waterways, and the ponds gradually filled. They were like enormous tanks of snoring fresh water, and they would make life a little easier on the island. It's amazing what an army of animals can do. But Rose was still worried. Summer was fast approaching, and the days were already growing long and hot. In the coming months, much of their drinking water would be lost to evaporation. Until the poison tide left and normal life returned, the water supply would always be at risk. Chapter 13. The Blaze. Dark clouds, distant rumbles, gusting wind. A storm was blowing over the island. The animals needed all the fresh water they could get, but no rain had fallen so far. And then came a blinding flash and a deafening crack. A moment later, smoke began rising from the eastern edge of the island. Lightning had struck a tree, sparks showered down, and the underbrush burst into flames. The poison tide had killed off the coastal vegetation, making it perfect fuel for a wildfire. If only it had started to rain, the fire might have been extinguished right then and there. But the rain refused to fall. By the time Rose arrived, the fire had grown into a roaring blaze. She ran over to one of the new dams and started tearing it apart. Branches and rocks and mud went flying until the dam broke and pond water flooded toward the fire. Steam shot into the air, but when it cleared, the fire was still burning. Flames quickly spread along the coast, crawling through dead fields and climbing up dead trees. Animals who had fled from the poison tide now hurried back to find their old homes ablaze. Sad voices cried out. Family members embraced each other. A crowd started to form, and Rose directed everyone to the great meadow. From there, they watched in horror as a wall of fire encircled the island. Plumes of smoke blowed up to the clouds. Glowing embers whirled away on the breeze. The sharp scent of burning brush filled the air. At last, rain. A drizzle, not a downpour. Very slowly, the blaze diminished. Hours later, the wildfire had ignited. The worst was over, but for days afterward, wisps of smoke continued rising from the ashes. Chapter 14. The Flock. Bright Bill had been the leader of the flock ever since his first migration. The geese followed him because they trusted him, and he hoped they'd trust him at one last time. The flock needs to leave, said Bright Bill to the other geese. We've all seen the damage done by the poison tide, and the situation is only getting worse. I think it's best if you find a safer place to leave. The geese glanced at each other, unsure what to say. And then Loudwing spoke up. What about you, Brightbill? It doesn't sound like you were going anywhere. My mother and my friends are trapped on this island, said Brightbill. So I will stay and help them as best I can, but the rest of you should leave. Gleamer turned to her mate. Brightbill, you know, I'd never leave you and Rose behind. If you're staying, I'm staying. I'm staying too, said Loudwing as she waddled over to join Gleamer and Brightbill. Before long, a whole gaggle of geese had joined their leader, committed to staying with him no matter what. However, not everyone joined. 5 other geese were huddled close, whispering. And then a goose named Fine Feather stood tall. There's nothing any of us can do about the poison tide, she said. We've decided to take Brightbill's advice and leave. The 2 groups of geese faced each other. For generations, through grueling journeys and harsh weather, their flock had been united. The members had changed, the times had changed, but the flock had always held together, until now. Where will you go? Said Brightbill. We'll fly over the ocean to the mainland, said Fine Weather, and we'll find a lake or a river where we can start a new life. Good luck to you, said Brightbill. May the wind be at your tails. Fine Feather took a deep breath. Then she beat her wings and led her small flock of geese into the sky. Chapter 15. The Flyaways. The sight of those 5 geese flying away from the island inspired the other birds to do the same. It was hard to blame them. Across the ocean was an easier, safer life, and as the poison tide wore on, more birds chose to fly away. There were tearful goodbyes as birds left old friends behind. Some birds felt so bad about leaving that they took off without saying a word. Before she left, Gale couldn't stop apologizing. I'm sorry, but I have to go, cried the gull. The poison tide is too much. I wish I could bring all of you with me. I am so sorry. Only the most determined bird stayed. Brightbill and his smaller flock stayed. Super stayed. A handful of other birds stayed. But the rest of them flew away, and nobody knew if they'd ever return.